Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much to Robert, Greta, the Saga Center for welcoming me. This has been a wonderful conference, and I hope that I will also contribute from our perspective. Uh, that biography is a little bit old. I'm now a national commissioner at the Human Rights Commission. That's where I'm coming from. So I've been asked to talk about the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was good to come after Senator Odette so we can have a comparison with the South African case study. Now, South Africa is a very interesting place because it's a country without a name, right? It's just called South Africa. You know, what does it mean to come from a country without a name? Only one or three countries in Africa without a name. Can you guess the other two without a name? Central African Republic. Netherlands, really. And the other one, Western Sahara. So South Africa, a country without a name, but a country that is also a microcosm of the world. You know, it's a country that features centrally in world history. You know, in the founding of the modern world, when Columbus was so-called discovering North America in 1492, South Africa was also having the same process. In fact, the first conflict between a white person and a black person in South Africa was in 1510. 1510. So South Africa is very different from most African countries where colonialism was from the late, the late 1800s to the 1960s. We are talking from 1510. Formal colonialism from 1652. I say this to remind you that South African history is very long. And it's a microcosm of the world because in South Africa we had everything: colonialism, genocide, slavery, dispossession, forced removal, so-called homelands. We had ghettos, concentration camps. Of course, we had apartheid. All of these things happened in South Africa. But also it's a country of hope, of course. It's a microcosm of hope. By the way, my name Tshepo means hope. So I also come with hope. The country of Mandela, the country of Desmond Tutu, a world-class constitution, very exemplary constitution. Of course, the rainbow people of South Africa, the rainbow people, diversity, a diverse society. And the TRC, as you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And yet, today, South Africa is not one of the most unequal countries in the world. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, according to the World Bank, according to the United Nations. The most unequal country in the world. So how do we understand this? How do we understand that on the one hand, we had this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, on the other hand, the most unequal country in the world, a country that is still, to a large extent, anti-black. Black majority, but anti-black. Can I move this thing? I'll give you some examples. In 2008, 68 people were killed in xenophobic attacks, 68 people. All of them black, killed by other black people. Internalized racism. By the way, half of the people that were killed were South African, but because they were dark, people thought they were coming from other parts of Africa. So we don't call it xenophobia, we call it Afrophobia. A country that is still very much internalized racism. 2012, you all know what happened in 2012 with Marikana, where 34 mine workers were killed by the police. These mine workers were on a strike, a protest for wages, for living wages. And they were shot and killed. Premeditated murder. An example of structural racism from the police. 2016, 144 mental health patients, 144, died. Most of them from dehydration, hunger. 144 mental health patients, most of them, or all of them black. Institutionalized racism. And then of course, in 2021, this is a penultimate, where there was a social unrest in 2 provinces in South Africa in 2021. And 350 people were killed. 350 people were killed. All of them black people in a social protest. These were people who, during COVID, were hungry and they engaged in a protest to get food. And 350 of them were killed. But it's not a scandal. Life moves on because black lives continue to be cheap in South Africa. So I've been asked to talk about the effect of the TRC 26 years later in South Africa. And maybe to borrow from Professor Jana, is the TRC an example of authentic mourning? Was the TRC an example of authentic mourning or a facilitator of authentic mourning? Or was it what Freud will call unyielding melancholy, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? So I know that on the one hand, the TRC is known as an example worldwide. That's why it's exported to many places, right? That's a TRC. I'm going to give another side. I'm not saying it's a truth, Robert. It's just another example of an understanding of the TRC, okay? And I'm going to be giving it from the perspective of this group, Khulumani Support Group. I was a spokesperson for this group for about 13 years. This is a group, a social movement of victims of apartheid, the largest social movement, about 104,000 members. A social movement, not an NGO, a social movement formed by victims, for victims, to struggle for reparation, for restitution, and for redress. Because after 1994, they thought that we didn't have this. So this was formed in 1995, this movement. And I called it a history of bad victims. It's a perspective from what I call bad victims. Bad victims are victims of mass atrocities who do not behave like good victims. Good victims are victims who accept the transition, who accept the compromise, who accept the elite reconciliation. Bad victims are bad victims because they reject liberal peace. They are bad victims because they refuse this narrative where, on every day of commemoration, victims come out, they tell their stories, they cry, they go home. Those are good victims. Khulumani are what I call bad victims. I came up with this phrase in 2007 in this article, if you want to read more about it, 2007. Bad victims. So the perspective that I'm going to give of the TRC is a perspective of what I call bad victims. So it's a long history. I'm going to condense it in about 20 minutes. why did we have the TRC? What was the TRC? What were the outcomes of the TRC? And then lastly, what could have been done differently? So that's what, in just 20 minutes, I'm going to try to talk to. So, Khulumani, the name means speak out. And of course, in the context where, people have been suppressed all their lives during apartheid and colonialism, it was important for victims to come up with their own organization where they speak out for themselves. Not lawyers, not academics, not judges, not NGOs speaking on their behalf. They wanted to speak out for themselves. So they came up with the word speak out. And the mission was to transform themselves into active citizens. Because of course, as you know, and I talk about this in one of my articles, Transitional Justice Entrepreneur. In most cases of transitional justice, there are people who produce victims, who speak on behalf of victims, right? So these people were refusing this narrative of transitional justice entrepreneurs, people who will speak on their behalf. So that's why they came up with this word. And our slogan is the following: the history is in the present. The past is in the present. The past is in the present. So a refusal of the idea that the past is in the past. Because that is central to South African mythology. Central to South African mythology. The idea that the past is in the past. Hence you have the word transitional justice, to transition from one A to B, transitional justice. Concepts such as the new South Africa, right? Newness. Mandela, and so forth. The idea of newness. So our slogan was the past is in the present, but also epistemologically it used to refuse the Western idea of time. In Western architecture of time, time is linear from A to B. In African cosmology, time is not linear. Time is cyclical, right? But in Western architecture, time is linear from A to B. So when we say the past is in the present, is to refuse epistemologically, culturally, cosmologically, the Western architecture of time. So the TRC had to deal with the past. And what is the past? The South African Constitution, in its preamble, talks about conflicts of the past. But it doesn't name these conflicts. It says conflicts of the past, the South African Constitution. If you read the South African Constitution, the word apartheid is not in the Constitution. The word colonialism is not in the Constitution. That is not just interesting, that is deliberate. Why would we have a new constitution, but the word apartheid, the word colonialism are missing? You will see why later on. But these are some of the conflicts of the past: genocide, colonization, Anglo-Boer War, apartheid, and so forth. The conflicts of the past. As I was saying earlier, from 1652, Dutch colonization, and then from 1806, the English, the British colonization. Long history, 100 years of fight, a series of wars against indigenous people for 100 years, culminating in the final defeat in 1892. That was the final defeat of indigenous people. Now, it's very important for us to say, what was the results of colonization? What was the results of the defeat of indigenous people? It was not just political conquest, of course. It was land dispossession. It was economic subjugation. It was epistemicide. Epistemicide meaning the killing of indigenous knowledge. Epistemicide, the killing of indigenous knowledge, the killing of indigenous ways of being in the world, their culture, their religion, their frame of reference. So if we say the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is supposed to deal with the past, this is the past that it was supposed to deal with, because this was the outcome of conquest. If we don't name exactly what conquest meant, and we simply talk about conflict of the past, as if there was two equal people fighting, and not conquest, not colonization, not economic subjugation, then the TRC itself participates in amnesia. The TRC itself, if it doesn't name exactly what it's supposed to undo, dismantle, then the TRC itself participates in collective amnesia. So how did we get to the TRC? And I'm skipping a lot because I'm mindful of time. How did we get to the TRC? No one won the war. The ANC of Mandela did not win the war. So there had to be negotiations. But most importantly, apartheid ended because of the economic question. The apartheid was too expensive. There were international economic sanctions. It's important how the war ends, because that determines what kind of transition you have. In the case of South Africa, the war ends, or the conflict ends, not because one party won, but because of economic sanctions. And therefore, there had to be compromise. So compromise, and then in the interim constitution, there was a word, there must be amnesties. Because of course the apartheid army was very powerful. The only army in Africa that had nuclear weapons. South Africa is and was still the only country in Africa with nuclear weapon. It did, destroy those weapons in 1993 before the ANC came to power. So there was no way to defeat the apartheid state, so there had to be negotiation. So I'm not one of those people that says there should not have been negotiations. There had to be negotiations. There had to be compromise. But what kind of compromise? That becomes the question. What kind of compromise? What kind of negotiations? So TRC, because it was a third way, not amnesty, full amnesty, but also not prosecutions. So a third way. What do you have? You can't prosecute these army generals because they're too powerful. On the other hand, you cannot have amnesia. So the TRC was thought of as a third way. But the TRC was also justified culturally to say it's Ubuntu. Ubuntu meaning this African humaneness. African humaneness. I am because you are, since you are, therefore I am. African humaneness. So no retribution, no revenge, but African humaneness. So that's how also the TRC was, justified. A sense of not retributive justice, but redistributive justice. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now you'll hear from the word, something is missing. The J is missing. It's only TRC. The J is missing. What is the J? Justice is missing. Truth and reconciliation. The J is missing. Compromise is always important. Setting a deal and sitting down with your so-called enemies, very, very important. But it's about what is the scope of that compromise for future generations, not for yourself, but for future generations. What is the scope of that compromise? The TRC established in 1995 for three purposes. Number one, to get a full picture of the past. What happened in the past? Full picture of the past. Number two, to give amnesties to those who qualify. So not blanket amnesty, individual amnesty, very, very important. And then lastly, to identify victims and to give them reparations. So on the one hand, for perpetrators, amnesty. On the other hand, for victims, reparations. That was the deal. That was the deal. Reparations for perpetrators, amnesty for perpetrators, and then reparations for victims. That was the deal. So you had three committees: the Amnesty Committee, where people applied for amnesty. You had the Human Rights Committee, that's where victims came to tell their stories and to be identified as victims. And then lastly, Reparations Committee. I'm mentioning this because there's a myth about the TRC. And the myth about the TRC is that it was a table of humanity. That's how people like to describe it. A table of humanity where victims and perpetrators met. That's not true. That is not true. Victims had their own committee. Perpetrators had their own committee. And for perpetrators to get amnesty, which was good, you did not have to say, I'm sorry. So you could get amnesty without saying you are sorry. All you had to do was to tell the truth and to connect the incident to a political motive. Only two criteria. Tell the truth, connect it to a political motive. So what most perpetrators did was to come to the TRC and then read their lawyer's letter. My name is Tshepo, I killed that person's father because he was black. Very robotic, very technical, and they got amnesty. Did not have to say sorry. The victims did not have anything to say, whether they accept it or not. That was the Amnesty Committee. In the Human Rights Committee, victims came to tell their stories and then to be identified as victims if their stories made sense. So they had to be certified as victims in the Human Rights Committee. In the end, I'm jumping up because I'm mindful of time. Only 16,000 people were identified as victims. Only 16,000 people were identified as victims. South Africa is a country of 63 million people, 63 million people. Apartheid was from 1948 to 1990, 1994, if you are generous. Only 16,000 people identified as victims. Now, I'm not even talking about colonialism. I'm even narrowing it down to apartheid. Only 10,000 people are identified as perpetrators, most of them from the ANC, by the way, not from the White Army. In their final report, the TRC says you must give victims money for 5 years. You must give victims money for 5 years as reparations. Okay? That is their recommendation. And then you must prosecute. I'm skipping. In the end, the TRC or the state rejected the TRC's recommendation and only gave 3,000 euros per person, 3,000 euros as reparation. Once off, 3,000 euros. It didn't matter whether your father was killed. It didn't matter whether your son was disappeared. It didn't matter whether you are a victim of sexual assault by the army. It didn't matter whether you had bullets within your bodies because you were shot at. Once off, 3,000 euros for everyone. So when we speak to victims and we say to them, what did you do with that 300,000? Most of them said, well, I took it and I bought alcohol. Some of them say I had so much debt, I paid those debts. So 300,000 euros is not reparations, because reparations, we know under international law, is supposed to restore you to a place where you were before the conflict, right? Before the incident. So this, you can't call it this meaningful reparation. 3,000 euros. What were the TRC's limitation in the last 5 minutes? The first limitation was the mandate was too narrow mandate. In the first place, the TRC only looked at a narrow period, apartheid. Now, us as black South Africans, we don't care about apartheid. We don't care about apartheid. Apartheid was from 1948 to 1994. What we care about is colonialism. But when we read about South Africa, people only mention apartheid. Why is that the case? It tells you something. Why, when people talk about South Africa, they don't talk about colonialism. They only talk about apartheid, which was very narrow, which was very short. So the mandate of the TRC was very short, only apartheid, but also narrow in a sense that it was only for 2 years. You heard Senator Odell saying they had theirs for 7 years. The TRC was only for 2 years. Only for 2 years, and that's it. When we talk about all the TRCs, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we always talk about the question of timing and sequence. Timing and sequence. When do you establish a TRC? The timing is very, very important. In the case of the South Africa, apartheid ended in 1994. The TRC was established in 1995. The timing was very bad. Was very bad because war was still going on in most places. War was still going on in most places, even though it was under democracy. But war was still going on. So a lot of people were still traumatized. And a lot of people did not trust state institutions, so they didn't go to the TRC. And a lot of people were still displaced, so they couldn't go to the TRC. Only 2 years. Too legalistic. People who came and said, I'm a victim. The evidence that was required, the evidence was a legal requirement. Show evidence as if we are in a court of law. So too legalistic. Bad history. What kind of truth are you going to go for? Are you going to go for narrative truth? Are you going to go for historical truth? Are you going to go for legal truth? Are you going to go for forensic truth? Very, very difficult what kind of truth you go for. And then finally, epistemicide. The TRC continued epistemicide. Legalistic, and by legalistic I mean in Western legal terms, not African legal terms, Western legal terms. But also epistemicide in a sense that very Christianity, because of Desmond Tutu and other commissioners, very, very Christian. So not African spirituality, not African religion. So continued epistemicide, the cultural genocide. But most importantly, the TRC focused on individuals, not the structure. Individuals. Individual perpetrator, individual victims. Not the structure of apartheid. Not the land question. Not the economic question. But individual perpetrator, individual victim. So people like my father was a mine worker. I didn't see my father, I only saw my father every 6 months because he worked in the mine and he died in the mine. So people like us whose families were destroyed to serve the apartheid economic system, that was not in the TRC mandate. They focused only on rape, torture, disappearance, not economic, not land. I've got 5 more minutes. So what has been done now? Only 4 people have been prosecuted after the end of the TRC. Only 4 people. Even though the TRC said, please go prosecute a lot of people. Only a few people were prosecuted. You can ask me why the ANC government has not prosecuted. I'll tell you if you ask that. Now we have inquest to find out why certain people died in police custody. This is very good because it will give closure to families. Closure, inquest, but also still individualized. So let me summarize then in terms of what the TRC achieved. Satisfaction, yes, people got recognition because they could tell their stories, some recognition. Symbols and memorials are there in South Africa. Street names have been changed. There are some holidays, national holidays, but no social reconciliation in terms of black people and white people. No social reconciliation. South Africa is still a deeply divided society if you go there. Deeply mistrust, even amongst younger generation, which is scary. As a national commissioner, I have to go to schools every time because of racism in schools. Rehabilitation, a lot of victims who went to the TRC reported being re-traumatized when they went to the TRC. We went there, we told our stories, but no meaningful reparation. We feel that we're used. Guarantee of non-repetition, yes, a new constitution, some institutional reforms, but no prosecutions. So a culture of impunity continue. Restitution, the land was the main reason for colonization. The land dispossession was the main reason for apartheid. The land has not been redistributed. White people who are 8% of the population own 70% of the land. 8% of the population own 70% of the land. So land is a ticking time bomb. That's a ticking time bomb in South Africa. And then lastly, compensation, as I said, no compensation, no community reparation. There was supposed to be community reparations for certain communities. That did not happen. And then lastly, the state is still using a closed list policy, meaning they're still only looking at people who went to the TRC. People who did not go to the TRC because they were too young, they were too traumatized, or some of them were in the queue at the TRC. But then the TRC said, oh, it's 5 o'clock, sorry, go home. Those people were left out of the TRC process, a closed list policy. So the lessons from South Africa are twofold. Number one, compromise, very, very important. But compromise must be based on justice. Compromise must be based on reversing the consequences of conflict, not superficially, the consequences of conflict. In the case of South Africa, the economy, the land question, the cultural question become important. If you don't do that, the TRC itself doesn't become an example of authentic mourning. It becomes complicit in collective amnesia and in perpetuating harm. Thank you so much.